Thank you all for being here for this great program tonight about one of Kansas City's greatest gifts to the world. I mean, of course, Melvin Tolson, but also Bob Farnsworth and Carmaletta Williams. I do want to mention a couple of upcoming programs at the library that you all might be interested in. I'll mention just a couple of what we're doing in the rest of February. Please pick up our calendar. It's a great month, a full month, and lots of stuff going on. But I do want to mention that next Tuesday at the Central Library, we have Walter Starr talking about his very, very well-reviewed biography of William Henry Seward, who was Lincoln's rival, a presidential candidate in 1860. Was one of the leaders of the anti-slavery movement in the United States before the Civil War, was expected to be president in 1860, and was defeated by Lincoln, of course, at the convention, but then became his Secretary of State and warmest supporter during the Civil War, and remained Secretary of State after Lincoln's death and into the later 1860s, and of course it was responsible for the purchase of what was known as Seward's Folly, the purchase of Alaska. Anyway, that should be fun on Tuesday night. It's a very good biography. I'm reading it now. On Wednesday, February 13th, we have the filmmakers who are making the PBS American Masters film about another favorite son of Kansas City, also not perhaps as well known as he ought to be, one of the perhaps two or three great American composers of the 20th century, Virgil Thompson, who, a lot like Tolson, was both a modernist and a great appreciator of folk traditions, which had a great influence on his music, and who was also, like Tolson, not only a great artist, but a great critic. You'll see the filmmakers, you'll see clips from the film that will be on PBS sometime later in the year, and interview with the filmmakers, James Arntz, John Paulson, and Kansas City's Amy Larrabee. And then on Valentine's Day, we have I think a perfect program. There's a wonderful book, and we're also reading it, called How the French Invented Love by Marilyn Yalom, and Marilyn will be at the Central Library. The Virgil Thompson program, by the way, on Wednesday is here. The Valentine's Day program is at the Central Library. Marilyn Yalom will tell us how the French invented love, and it's a great look at the history of romance through great literature, great French literature. And then I think the last thing I'll mention that's upcoming is we have one of the leading historians of the civil rights movement and the history of African Americans. Leon Litwack will be here talking about the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, and that's on February 28th, again here at the Plaza. So look for that. We also will have a program on March 1st as part of the McKinsey Symposium, UMKC's ongoing history program on the Long March, America's Enduring Struggle for Civil Rights. So lots of interesting stuff, and those are just some of the highlights. And so please pick up our calendar. Also our Script in Hand series, which we just kicked off, is another version of Women of the Years, plays about women and by women, which is ongoing, and look forward to that. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce my longtime friend and debating partner. I mean, I thought The Great Debaters was going to be about me and Bob. Over the years, arguing about China, about relative worth of Chinese literature, about the place of Edgar Snow in the world, or Agnes Smedley, and Bob and I have had this friendly disagreements about various things. In fact, we were just arguing about the Meet the Past episode where I interviewed Edgar Snow, and of course Bob knows more about Edgar Snow than anybody, especially knows more about it than me. And so we did two versions of this, and I kind of, each time Bob was in the audience, and I was wondering what he thought, and now I know. He liked the first one and he didn't like the second one. I'm glad I pleased him the first time, and I will have to figure out what I did wrong the second time. We've had a challenging relationship over the years in which, like any great debate, like any great mixture of ideas, both sides can learn something, or at least in the case of Bob and me, I learn a lot from him every time I sit down and talk to him. He's been a great scholar at UMKC, specializing in African American literature and in Chinese literature. He's written a great book about Edgar Snow, Edgar Snow's Journey South of the Clouds, an edited book with his commentary. He's written From Vagabond to Journalist, Edgar Snow in Asia, 1928 to 1940, the key years of Snow's becoming the greatest journalist, American journalist of his time, and discovering China for the West, in effect. And of course, as the biographer of Melvin Tolson, he's become perhaps well known lately in an unusual way because of the movie The Great Debaters, starring Denzel Washington. Though of course, I'm sure Bob is the only person in the audience tonight who didn't suffer the disappointment that they didn't cast me in the role of Melvin Tolson. It's a small joke, obviously. But Melvin Tolson deserves to be even better known than he is now with the Great Debaters, because the great thing that he did was his poetry and his own commentary, his own criticism, literary journalism. He's really one of the great unknown writers in American history, and certainly in the 20th century. His modernist poetry kind of fell between two stools. And Bob, I hope we'll talk about this. The great folk tradition out of which a lot of the Harlem Renaissance came, and Langston Hughes, our other great favorite poetic son from this part of the world. But in the modernist part, he never quite was central to the movement of Eliot and Stevens and others, though he clearly was influenced by them, and he wrote great modernist poetry. So he's a little bit lost in the history of American literature, and he should be better known because he's a great poet, a great critic, a great figure in the history of our literature. And it is typical of Bob, who in essence rediscovered Edgar Snow, helped the United States discover Chinese literature over the last 30 or 40 years, that he did the same thing for this great figure in African American literature, in American literature. So it's a pleasure to invite Bob, and the other thing about Bob, of course, is he's an emeritus professor of English at UMKC, and a great teacher. He's been teaching me stubbornly for 30 or 40 years, but he'll come up here with his student, who has gone on to herself become a professor at Johnson County Community College, Carmaletta Williams, who will read Melvin Tolson's poetry while Bob talks about it. So ladies and gentlemen, Robert Farnsworth, Carmaletta Williams. Thank you.
Hello. Good evening.
I saw the movie with many of you. It's a hard act to follow. I'm not going to quarrel with the movie in any way. It's a great movie. I have written an essay about it earlier, about the movie and Tolson, which is in New Letters, and if you're interested in my full views about that, you can find that over on the table. But I would like to point out the movie seized upon a particularly strong relationship between Melvin Tolson and James Farmer. And that relationship clearly controlled some of the things that happened in the movie. In his autobiography, Lay Bare the Heart, Farmer noted that he was only 14 years old when he began studying at Wiley College. He also mentioned that he was tall and slim. He describes the rich variety of growing up experiences he tasted there, but then comments, quote, "The banquet of my Wiley years was the tutelage of Tolson." The title of the chapter in which this quote appears is called Intellectual Coming of Age, Tolstoy and Tolson. So Farmer and Tolson had a relationship that went on all through their lives. It's a strong relationship, and I wanted to note that. I think that it's probably pretty clear that the reason why the movie has the last debate against Harvard College as the national champions in 1935, instead of the University of Southern California, who were the actual champions, was to be able to move the whole thing to Harvard and bring in Thoreau, civil disobedience, and Farmer's development of the whole nonviolent philosophy when he established CORE. So I think that's part of the interest of the film. I'm not going to say much more about the film than that at this time. I would rather spend a little bit of time saying something about Tolson's connections to Kansas City, and then a lot more time talking about the poetry that I think is really the major reason why Tolson should be remembered. Melvin Tolson was born, I get an echo in here, do you get it out there? Okay? Okay. Melvin Tolson was born to Alonzo Tolson and Lara Hurt Tolson in Moberly, Missouri, 115 years ago today. His father, Alonzo, had just recently joined the Central Missouri Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church as a minister. In the next few years, he was assigned to several small towns in Missouri and Iowa before moving to Independence, Missouri, probably in 1916. The move enabled his son, Melvin, to enroll in Lincoln High School in Kansas City, known to the larger black community of the area as one of the best schools available in the nation. Yeah, there's a long Lincoln tradition, not only with Tolson, but I just finished a biography of Leon Jordan, and his family also was all Lincoln. Well, we won't go, I can get sidetracked with all that. Lincoln is a great place, no question. Tolson's early showed talent as a public speaker. In 1917, he was one of a few chosen to compete in a Lincoln oratorical contest. When his turn came, he won much applause with his witty and eloquent opening remarks, but as he began to speak, he suddenly dropped to the floor in a dead faint. He was carried backstage and revived. He won only sympathy. He later wrote caviar and cabbage columns describing the summer work he did in Kansas City stockyards and among the households of Kansas City's affluent country club neighborhood. He published 2 stories in the Lincolnian, and he was chosen to write the class poem, for his graduation. I'd like Dr. Carmaletta Williams to read that poem now.
Our hearts beat fast, our eyes flame with desire, our souls long for the battle smoke of strife. These very walls instill the eternal fire that makes men winners in the race of life. The maxims taught will make both mind and bones fit for the mighty trials we all must bear. But out of them we'll fashion stepping stones. In black misfortunes we shall not despair.
Tolson had a sister, Helen, who was 2 years younger than he was. She also attended Lincoln, and she made Kansas City her home for many years before moving to Detroit. But in both Kansas City and Detroit, she worked diligently and effectively to get her brother's various achievements recognized. When I was reading proof of my introduction to Tolson's A Gallery of Harlem Portraits, I got an urgent call from Dr. Melvin B. Tolson, Jr., who was then in Washington looking up some census records for his family. He had just discovered that his father was born in 1898, not in 1900, as his father had long represented. He wanted to let me know before my introduction went to press. He convinced me that my evidence was solid, and I called my editor. Either that day or the next, I got a frantic call from Helen Tolson Wilson, insisting that what her nephew had found was not true, that her brother was indeed born in 1900. It took a while for me to realize that she had followed her brother in taking 2 years off her official life and was not going to admit the fact without an argument. Tolson's parents made a couple of more moves before returning to Kansas City, where they remained for the rest of their lives. There were frequent family trips between Marshall, Texas, and Kansas City over the years. I became involved with Tolson's poetry late 1972. David Ray, the editor of New Letters, plopped a manuscript on my desk and asked my advice about whether to publish it. Roy P. Bassler was the author. He was a noted scholar, then serving as chief of the manuscript division of the Library of Congress. In his manuscript, Bassler argued that Tolson's Harlem Gallery was likely to be the most representative American poem of the 20th century. I was a little taken aback by that audacious claim, but I told David, yes, we should publish it. I have since come to believe Bassler was a better critic than I then thought. Bassler then asked Ray if he would be interested in publishing other Tolson pieces. Ray agreed to consider them. Ray then learned from Bassler that there was a significant body of work left unpublished with the Tolson family that Bassler was trying to get into the Library of Congress. That led Ray to correspond with Ruth Tolson and eventually to suggest to both her and me that I might edit and place these manuscripts. I flew to Washington, examined the manuscripts, met Ruth and other members of the family, and agreed to edit the manuscripts. After placing some of the early poems in magazines, I found the University of Missouri Press willing to publish A Gallery of Harlem Portraits, the first book that Tolson never was able to publish during his lifetime. That was the book about to come out when I received Mel Tolson's call about his father's birthday. Tolson began writing poetry when he was 14, but his year in New York City, 1930 to 1931, when he met the emerging poets of the Harlem Renaissance, gave his poetic ambitions a remarkable boost. He had a fellowship to earn a master's degree at Columbia University. He wrote a thesis on the Harlem Renaissance and he reveled in the new friendships, particularly with Langston Hughes. He began writing a series of dramatic portrait poems about the residents of Harlem, meant to give a collective representation of Harlem as Edgar Lee Masters had built a collective picture of Spoon River. Harlem fascinated Tolson, not only as a community in itself, but as the cultural capital of the new Negro, a race of people emerging from the degradation of slavery, but armed by their suffering and the wisdom gained from their struggle, and then coming into their own as new cultural leaders in the world. The ambition born during those years stayed with Tolson throughout his life. His first attempt at a book of poems, A Gallery of Harlem Portraits, becomes the basis from which, in the final years of his life, he creates the epic Harlem Gallery, Book One, The Curator. As a taste of the transformative process that went on over the years in his imagination, I would like to ask Dr. Williams to read two poems from A Gallery, Wu Shang and African China. The stories of these two poems were then reworked to create a second, African China, that was published many years later in 1950.
Wu Shang, lover of elegant phrases, hated the laundry work to which Kismet had chained him, but his trade grew steadily despite his shortcomings, for his sunny spirit and jeweled philosophy charmed dusky customers. One day, an ugly, sooty black woman, whose enormous corset was about to burst under the strain of the rebellious flesh, bristled up to the little laundryman. Wu Shang, smiling his artless smile, said, "My dear lady, the time was short and the work was long, and Wu Shang is humbled to know that the unavoidable delay upsets the lady and hides for one moment the beauty of her face." The ugly, sooty black woman dropped her angry manner as if it were a hot poker. One day, a Harlem sweet man, hurrying to keep a date with a highbrow, strode up and down his laundry, wild-eyed and profane. Wu Shang, unruffled, thinking of the vagaries of men, finally insinuated, "A wise man does not reveal his weakness by hurrying to keep an engagement with a woman, though she is thrice beautiful, and a wise lover is a lover who feeds his beloved on guesses." The Harlem sweet man quieted down, clapped Wu Shang on the back, almost prostrating him, and grinned. "You know your stuff about women's, Wu Shang." When Wu Shang saw the agony in the face of Louis Jackson, he knew his customer suffered from the torture of tortures. Little by little, the patient Oriental drew the tragedy from Jackson's reluctant lips. "My friend of many years," said Wu Shang, "it is easier by far to understand the 7 stars than the caprices of a woman. For the ways of a woman are as changeable as the ways of and beyond the understanding of 7 Buddhas. A wise man attempts not to change the course of the wind." The words of Wu Shang were a balm of Gilead to his ebony customer's mind. Gratitude flowed into his eyes. He nodded, said something that Wu Shang's quick ear could not catch, and walked out, silence brooding behind him. Africa, China. East is east and west is west, you hears the people say, but when you mixes east and south, the devil is to pay. Mabel worked in the hand laundry of Lu Sing, and her friends laughed derisively when she married the little yellow man whose parables glittered with epigrams. Along 8th Avenue, wise old women said the marriage would turn out badly because it was the marriage of Africa and China. But that was long, long ago. Lu Sing says his Mabel is a dusky passion flower that has not lost its charm where the passing of envious years. And Mabel says her Lu Sing is a restful oasis blessed by Allah in the desert of Harlem manhood. Lu Sing and Mabel are proud of their love child, a son with the oriental features of the father and the ebony skin of the mother. And the children along 8th Avenue call the son African China. African China. A connoisseur of pearl necklace phrases, Wu Shang disdains his laundry, lazes among his bric-a-brac, metaphysical. And yet dark customers on Harlem's rack, quizzical. Sweat and pack, the Fort Caldera of his Stygian shop, some worship God and some bebop. Wu Shang discovers the diademed word to be on the sly a master key to Harlem pocketbooks, out-jockeyed by policy and brimstone, theology alone. As bust and hips her corset burst, an Amazonian fantasy, a witness of Jehovah. By job and husband cursed, lumbers in, a yellow mummy in a mummery, a tiptoe. Wu Shang unsheathes a grin, and then his finger sleeve gulps an ugh and eats his crow, disarmed by ugliness disbelieved. At last he takes his wits from balls of moth, salams, "Dear lady, I for you wear goat sackcloth to mark this hour and place. Cursed be the shadow of delay that for a trice conceals a trace of beauty in my face." Her mug of anger emptied, now he sighs. Her kind cannot play euchre. The master trick belongs to him who holds the joker. His mind's eye sees a black hand drop a red-white poker. The ginger gigolo, vexed by the harrow of a date and vanity torn, goddamns the yellow sage. 4 million yellow born and yellow fate. The gigolo, a wayward bronco, seen but unheard, Wu Shang applies the curb bit word. Wise lovers know that in their lottery success belongs to him who plays a woman with tidbits of a guess. The sweet man's sport of whack paralyzes Wu Shang's back. "Say, yellow boy, I call your stuff the hottest dope in town. The red-hot mama'll never know she got her daddy down." Sometimes the living dead stalk in and sue for grace. The tragic uncommon in the comic commonplace. The evil that the good begets and loves embrace. A Harlem melodrama like that in Big John's face. As Wu Shang peers at him and cudgels a theorem, the sage says in a voice, "I like Iglik, do you direct the weathercock?" And then his last rack of rock descends with a bang. "Show me the man who is not throwing a boomerang." Words, no longer pearls, but drops of Gilead's balm. Later, Wu Shang remarks, Sirocco's mar the toughest palm. The bigger thing, as always, goes unsaid. The look behind the door of Big John's eyes, awareness of the steps of eyes, the freedom of the wise. When Dixie Dixon breaks a leg on Arctic Lenox Avenue and Wu Shang hums her, pays her fees, old Kismet knots the two, unraveled destinies. The unperfumed wag-foot, four-finger head, and belly laughter waifs ghost rats, foxed by the smells of meat and bread. And black walls blab, "Good God, China and Africa gets wed." Wu Shang, whom nothing sears, says Dixie is a dusky passion flower, unsoiled by envious years. And Dixie says her Wu Shang is a Mandarin with 7 times 7 ways of love. Her very own oasis in the desert of Harlem men. In dignity, Wu Shang and Dixie walk the gauntlet, Lenox Avenue. Their son has Wu Shang's cast and Dixie's hue. The dusky children roll their oyster eyes at Wu Shang Jr., flash a premature surmise as if afraid. In accents Carolina on the streets they never made, the dusky children tease African China.
You can see the much more playful narrative of the poem and the more dramatic irony as he builds the story of the two poems. Before the publication of the second African China, and while still at Wiley, having the phenomenal success as a debate coach, Tolson won the National Poetry Contest, sponsored by the American Negro Exposition in 1938 with Dark Symphony. Atlantic Monthly published that poem, and one of its editors, Mary Lou Chamberlain, encouraged Tolson to submit a new collection of poems to Dodd Mead. Earl Robinson set the poem to music. Common Ground then asked Tolson for a poem. He sent them Rendezvous with America, and it became the title of the book manuscript Dodd Mead accepted a few days before Christmas in 1943. While now winning national recognition as a poet, Tolson also wrote a weekly column for the Washington Tribune called Caviar and Cabbage. It was a popular and outspoken commentary on politics and culture that the Tribune carried from 1937 to 1948. That a professor at a small black college in Marshall, Texas, could speak to the sophisticated Washington, D.C. African-American community popularly and authoritatively for 11 years is a tribute to Tolson's extraordinary public talents. To add luster to his achievement as a columnist, 2 of his columns, reviewing the appearance of the immediately popular movie Gone with the Wind, have recently been chosen as one of the best 20th century movie reviews by Philip Lope. Hobart Jarrett, one of his lead debaters, went on to become chairman of the English department at Langston University. In 1947, he invited his former professor to join the department at Langston. Wiley had no retirement benefits for its faculty and relatively poor pay. So with all his children in college, Melvin and Ruth regretfully pulled up roots and moved to Langston, Oklahoma. The Tolson family was extraordinarily devoted to education. All 3 sons knew from their teenage years they were destined to get PhDs, and they did. Tolson's daughter, Ruth, earned an MA in library science, and his wife, Ruth, after their children aged sufficiently, finished her BA degree and then earned an MA in education. Ramona Lowe paid tribute to Tolson's legacy at Wiley as they were leaving in the Chicago Defender. Quote, Tolson, a man with boundless energy, a gleam in his eye, and a ready sense of humor, has been described as a voice crying in the wilderness. He has been teaching at Wiley College in Marshall, Texas for 22 years. Most college students in the Deep South who do not know him have heard about him. They have heard of his belief in the oneness of little people everywhere, no matter what their race. They have heard of his fearlessness before lynch mobs. One Texan who led a mob against him later gave a piano to his little theater, unquote. At Langston, the energy Tolson had devoted to debate was turned largely to the theater. He created the Dust Bowl Players. In June 1952, the NAACP held its 43rd National Convention in Oklahoma City. Tolson wrote and directed a dramatic version of Walter White's Fire in the Flint that was featured at the convention. He directed a performance of Sartre's No Exit in 1955 and dedicated the performance to Liberian Ambassador Clarence Simpson. He followed that quickly with a play based upon Langston Hughes' remarkable Jessie B. Simple, called Simply Heavenly. Both Hughes and Simpson visited and so gave the Dust Bowl players significant recognition. As an undergraduate at Lincoln University, Tolson was a member of the debate team along with Horace Mann Bond, who would in the 40s rise to become president of Lincoln University, and who would also father the civil rights leader, Julian Bond. Tolson and Bond kept a cordial correspondence throughout their lives. Lincoln University began as Ashman Institute, named after one of the original American settlers of Liberia, Yehudi Ashman. Lincoln had a lengthy and substantial relationship with the Liberian political leaders ever since. Tolson's success with Rendezvous with America gave Claps Bond, Claps was the nickname that Tolson gave him, or not that he gave him, but that he knew him by, gave Claps Bond the cultural leverage to nominate Tolson as Poet Laureate of Liberia. Tolson responded to the honor by writing libretto for the Liberian Republic, just as Duke Ellington responded to his being similarly honored with the Liberian Suite. Atlantic Monthly rejected an early version of libretto, acknowledging the poem's strong performance, but noting that such a long poem was ruled out automatically. Bond then suggested the poem be published as a book and offered some financial support. While Tolson negotiated with Decker Press to publish it, he also invited Alan Tate to write an introduction. Decker Press regrettably folded, but Alan Tate accepted Tolson's invitation. Then, with the support of Carl Shapiro and John Ciardi, Twain Publishers accepted and published the book in 1953. Since Rendezvous, Tolson had been intensively reading the new critics and particularly their iconic poet T.S. Eliot. He concluded that Eliot had indeed effected a revolution in modern poetry, but he disdained Eliot's politics. More and more, he assumed the obligation of writing poetry in the modern vein, but with political themes that championed the cause of those who had been trampled on by racism and imperial rule. Winning such an eminent critic as Alan Tate's agreement to write the introduction for libretto seemed like a remarkable professional coup. I would like to have Dr. Williams read from Alan Tate's introduction and then the two opening stanzas of libretto.
Alan Tate suggested that Tolson was in a direct line of poetic descent from Hart Crane. He concludes, "In the end, I found that I was reading libretto for the New Republic of Liberia, not because Mr. Tolson is a Negro, but because he is a poet. Not because the poem has a Negro subject, but because it is about the world of all men. And this subject is not merely asserted, it is embodied in a rich and complex language and realized in terms of the poetic imagination." The poem, Liberia, no micro footnote in a Bunyan book, honed by a pedant with a gelded look. You are the ladder of survival dawn, men saw, in the quicksilver sparrow that slips the eagle's claw. Liberia? No sideshow barker's bio-accident, no corpse of a soul's errand to the dark continent. You are the lightning rod of Europe, Canaan's key, the rope across the abyss, mere like for the Africa to be. Thank you.
Within months after Libretto's publication, Tolson was offered a fellowship at the Breadloaf Writers' Conference and an opportunity to meet and talk with Robert Frost, whom he very much admired. Lincoln University awarded him an honorary Doctor of Letters. The Liberian government conferred upon him the Order of the Star of Africa. And back home, his fellow citizens of Langston elected him their mayor for the first of what would become 4 successive 2-year terms. Shortly after Breadloaf, President William V.S. Tubman of Liberia arrived in New York for an extended American visit. Tolson was invited to be a guest at important official welcoming ceremonies in the city and met New York Mayor Robert F. Wagner as a fellow mayor. He initially seemed successful in persuading President Tubman to include a visit to Langston on his American itinerary, but regrettably, Tubman became ill and shortened his visit. However, Tubman did invite Tolson to be a guest at his 3rd inaugural convention in Monrovia in 1956. This visit, Tolson's only travel abroad, enabled Tolson to stop in Paris on the return trip to spend time with Melvin Jr., then studying at the Sorbonne, and to have lunch with Richard Wright. While Libretto was still being prepared for book publication in September 1951, Tolson published E and O.E. in Poetry magazine. The title is an abbreviation for Errors and Omissions Accepted. The poem dramatizes the dilemma of a Black American poet given a Jonah-like commandment to deliver God's message to Nineveh in an apocalyptic moment of history. It won for its author poetry's Bess Hokum Award of the Year. The poem is significant not only for what Tolson thinks of the Black American poet's dilemma mid-century, but he brings the poem back years later in Harlem Gallery as a dramatic discovery of a private manuscript belonging to Hi-De-Ho Heights. There, the quotation he uses from the original poem contains a slight change that significantly characterizes Heights' role. Dr. Williams will read the Poet's Dilemma from E and O.E.
The Poet's Dilemma in 1951, though I dot my I's in this and rend the horns of tribal echosis, the great white world's uncrossed T pockets the skeleton key to doors beyond Black chrysalis. Why place an empty pail before a well of dry bones? Why go to Neva to tell the ailing that they ail? Why lose the golden fleece to gain the Holy Grail?
Tolson's ambition grew with his recognition. After Libretto, he planned a grand 5-volume poetic odyssey of the Black American people. Book 1, The Curator, was to be rooted in his memories of Harlem, now examined with far more searching analyses of their cultural and historical implications. It was to measure how far his people had come. He published the first sections of Book 1 in The Prairie Schooner, then edited by Carl Shapiro in the fall of 1961. The full book was published by Twain in 1965 with an introduction by Shapiro. I would like Dr. Williams to read a poem attributed to Hi-De-Ho Heights in Harlem Gallery. Hi-De-Ho Heights' name is made up of a word made famous by a repeated voice vocal hallmark of Cab Calloway, and the last name of another of Tolson's wily lead debaters, Henry Heights. I really think after looking at the movie that it's Henry Lowe that was modeled after Henry Heights that on the debate team, really.
Effervescent like acid on limestone, Heidi Ho said, "Oh, white folks, oh, black folks, the dinosaur imagined its extinction meant the death of piss ants."
Now I'd like to read Dr. Williams to read a part of the poem addressed to white boy and black boy.
White boy, black boy, you've played blackjack with Tika, you've shot craps with Hap, yet things as they are in the ghetto have sported you for a sap. Sometimes a guy born in a house with the graffito of doom lucks upon the know-how of a raccoon that gnaws off its leg to escape from a trap. Now, the difference between you and me is the little matter of a Harvard PhD. You may have a better brain, but no nester taught you how to get rid of its ball and chain.
And finally, I'd like Dr. Williams to read the last two stanzas of the poem.
In the black ghetto, the white heather and the white almond grow. By the hyacinth and asphodel blow in the white metropolis. O Clabilus, O Theos, Solon, Periander, Bias, Chilo, O Pittacus, unriddle the phoenix riddle of this. Our public may possess in art a Matangus figure, arctic rigidity, yet, I hazard, yet, this allegro of the Harlem Gallery is not a chippy fire, for here in focus are paintings that chronicle a people's new world odyssey from chattel to Esquire.
Tolson was operated on for gallstones when he was reading galley proofs for his book. During the operation, cancer was discovered. It had metastasized. The prognosis was death within months. But an operation by a cancer specialist in Dallas seemed to postpone the worst indefinitely. Shapiro's introduction was published on the front page of Book Week in both the New York Herald Tribune and the Washington Post. Tolson, in his hospital room in Dallas, read the opening lines, quote, "A great poet has been living in our midst for decades and is almost totally unknown, even by the literati, even by poets," unquote. Despite his cancer, Tolson zestfully embraced Twain's efforts to promote his new book. He traveled to New York, Detroit, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. Langston Hughes introduced him for a reading at the American Society for African Culture. He received a standing ovation. Harvey Shapiro of the New York Times asked Tolson to write an article on a subject of his own choosing. Nona Balakian of the New York Times Book Review requested Tolson do a book review. He favorably reviewed his former debater, James Farmer's Freedom When. Just before that, he was named to the Herald Tribune's Book Review Board. He had reached 65, according to the birth date he claimed, the mandatory retirement age at Langston. Langston dedicated its Spring Fine Arts Festival to its distinguished poet and teacher. Carl Shapiro came for the occasion. Of his stay, Shapiro later wrote to the Tolsons, "It was overwhelming for me, one of the great moments of my life. You're scary and unscathed, really heroic to me. Another of Tolson's debaters, Eura Qualls, had become chair of the English department at Tuskegee University. She believed in Tolson's retirement no more than he did. She succeeded in getting her former mentor named to the Avalon Chair of the Humanities at Tuskegee for the next academic year. In October 1965, Tolson gave a reading for the Gertrude Clark Whittle Poetry and Literature Fund at the Library of Congress. He was the principal speaker at a banquet of the Oklahoma State College in Stillwater in February 1965. On March 6th, he was flown to the New York City's Philharmonic Hall as the mystery guest, joining Sammy Davis Jr., Harry Belafonte, and others in a tribute to his former student and lead debater, James Farmer. A week later, his youngest son, Dr. Wiley Wilson Tolson, was named the first Carver Foundation Fellow Lecturer at Tuskegee. Late in May, he was back in New York City with Ruth for what many would consider the pinnacle of cultural recognition. He was honored by the American Academy of Arts and Letters with a $2,500 award as a poet and playwright. George Kennan presided over the black tie event. Other writers honored included William Alfred, John Barth, James Dickey, H.E.F. Donahue, Shirley Hazard, Josephine Herbst, Edwin Honig, and Gary Snyder. In June, the Tolsons proudly attended Oklahoma State's awarding of the doctorate to their son, Arthur. A few days later, Tolson returned to Dallas and entered St. Paul's Hospital for what unexpectedly would be his last stay. Ironically, the Rockefeller Foundation awarded him a $5,000 grant to cover his living and traveling expenses for the next 4 months. After an operation, he seemed stable and clear-eyed for the next few days. On Sunday, August 29th, Melvin Jr. left the hospital to return to Norman. Ruth and Ruth Marie stayed in his room until 5:30 p.m. before leaving. That night, about 9:30, two attendants suddenly realized that he was not responding to their talk. They were surprised to find that he had passed.
And Dr. Robert Farnsworth, in his ending to Melvin Tolson Revisited, wrote, "His extraordinary will to live convinced his wife and his children, no matter what the doctor said, the death could not claim him, but he relinquished life peacefully, content at last to live in the memories of family and friends, and in the words he had woven with such passion and humor and care for the world that would succeed him, content to wait for the vertical audience to nurture his carefully wrought ironies into recognized truths that would crumble the idols of the tribe and bond mankind, instead in the promise of universal democratic brotherhood." I love that.
Carmaletta preempted me. I also have a closing paragraph.
You can do that, but this one, I wanted to make sure they heard your words.
Let me say what I was going to say. But they'll both work. Debate was a central theme in Tolson's life. He valued the truth that came from clashing arguments. In Harlem Gallery, his final and greatest poem, a curator, an Africanist, a musician-poet, an artist-poet, and a poet vie with each other in pressing their visions on each other. None is given the final say. The truth of the poem is the synthesis of their clashing argument. The quality of democracy depends on the quality of its collective arguments. Melvin Tolson was indeed a great debate coach, but his greatest coaching job was finally Harlem Gallery. Thank you.